Welcome to this presentation which looks at recent changes to the sea trout population along the west coast of Scotland. A regular correspondent recently sent me some photos of sea trout caught from a west coast sea loch and from a location near an aquaculture facility. The fish were about 2 pounds in weight and were healthy and in very good condition. Pictures of the fish I shared prompted many comments from my other correspondents. About the same time, I was looking through my archive and happened across an article that had appeared in Trout and Salmon magazine at the beginning of 2017. This had been written by Andrew Graham Stewart of Salmon and Trout Conservation and was titled, "Why Dr Jaffa is So Wrong." The background to the article is that Mr Graham Stewart had previously written something about me that was considered defamatory. As recompense, the magazine's managing director agreed to allow me to write an article in defence of the salmon farming industry. The editor then gave Mr Graham Stewart the opportunity to respond. Mr Graham Stewart makes many points in the article. For example, he asks what else except the presence of salmon farming and its role in sea lice proliferation can explain that virtually all sea trout do not survive more than a few months at sea. Yet the pictured fish seems to have survived sufficiently long enough to reach a decent weight for West Coast sea trout. He also highlighted what he calls the catastrophic demise of larger sea trout. What is unclear from his comments is how large is a larger sea trout. In his 1930s book about trout, G. Herbert Nall pictured 3 examples of sea trout of 13 to 13.5 pounds weight. One was caught in 1922 and 2 in 1927. These photos often appear as examples of how trout used to be, but there have been few, if any, examples of such large fish caught since. Although I'll picture one from the 1950s later in this presentation, it's unclear whether such fish were unique examples or were relatively commonplace. This graph is taken from a presentation given by Dr. Andy Walker at a meeting in 1993 to discuss the problems with wild fish in the Northwest Highlands. The graph shows that the mean weight dropped in the late 1980s, which some might suggest coincides with the arrival of salmon farming in Loch Ewe. However, this data relates to fish caught across the whole region, not just in one loch. The actual fall in weight is about half a pound, but what really surprised me is that from 1952 onwards, long before the advent of commercial salmon farming, the average weight of sea trout caught in the region was just under 1.7 pounds, which is a long way from the 13.5 pound specimens caught during the 1920s. In his 2016 report for Salmon and Trout Conservation, Dr. Andy Walker included an extended graph of the same data, but now expressed in kilos. The drop in weight shown in the earlier graph occurred in the highlighted area, and so it can be seen that the weights continued to fall until the late 1990s. What is surprising is that the average weight of the fish then increased back to the former levels after 2000, despite the expansion of salmon farming industry and against a background of reduced catches. I have no explanation for this change, and Andy Walker does not provide one either. In an attempt to try to understand the trends in the previous graph, I decided to produce my own graph from the official Marine Scotland science data. My graph also shows a dip in the mid-90s, but at most the difference was only just over 100 grams. What is clear is that from the 1950s the average weight of sea trout has been increasing over a period of time when catches have been decreasing. As my original article was written about Loch Maree, I've also tracked average weights of sea trout in the Ewe system. In total contrast to average weights in the region, the average weight of sea trout caught from Loch Maree has fallen by over half. In their paper about the collapse of Loch Maree sea trout, Butler and Walker put the average weight of sea trout prior to the arrival of salmon farming in Loch Ewe at 540 grams, and this fell to 340 grams during the 1990s. These weights can be seen to be much lower than those derived from the official Marine Scotland science catch data. In his report for Salmon and Trout Conservation, Dr Walker includes a photograph of a page of the catch records from the Loch Maree Hotel Angling Book. I presume that this is a random page aimed at showing the state of the catches prior to the arrival of salmon farming to the area. The page is dated 7th to 9th of September 1981. The page records that 74 sea trout were caught by several boats over 3 days. There are 16 fish recorded as the heaviest fish of the day. 9 were under 3 pounds, 4 weighed between 3 and 4 pounds, 3 weighed between 4 and 5 pounds, and 1 fish weighed 6 pounds. The average weight of all the fish caught was just under 2 pounds, typically similar to the fish shown at the start of this presentation. The annual review published by Fisheries Management Scotland includes, where possible, the weight of the best salmon and sea trout caught in each river system across Scotland. This table lists the best catch for rivers in the west of Scotland from 2009 to 2019. Attention should be drawn to the 8-pound fish caught in the Laxford in 2015 and the 6.5-pound fish caught in the Lochie the year before, and most especially the 5.5-pound fish caught from the U system also in 2014. For the area, these are clearly large fish. As well as highlighting the catastrophic demise of large sea trout in the region, Mr. Graham Stewart asks why virtually all the sea trout in the main salmon farming areas never mature. The simple answer is that some fish must be maturing in the aquaculture zone, otherwise this sea trout caught in July 2020 could not exist. This fish must have had mature parents. The Wild Trout Trust have posted a sea trout recognition poster produced by the Atlantic Salmon Trust on their website. The text states that mature sea trout vary widely in size, but typically at first spawning they may range from half a kilo to 1.5 kilos in weight. The average weight of sea trout in Loch Maree for the 10 years after the salmon farm was established in Loch Ewe was 0.65 kilos, which is 150 grams higher than the minimum weight of maturation stated by the Atlantic Salmon Trust. This is also the current average weight of sea trout caught across the whole of the aquaculture zone, which is higher than the average weight for fish from the region back in the 1950s. However, even smaller sea trout can also mature. A report from the first International Sea Trout Symposium in 2004 suggests that some returning finnock, the name for small sea trout, can breed. The specific study is by Andy Walker, who looked at the maturation age of sea trout returning to the higher reaches of the River Tay on Scotland's east coast. The study showed that finnock made up about 4% of the maturing stock in the river over a period of at least 10 years. This is in a stock where the majority of fish mature in their second or third year. The Atlantic Salmon Trust Guide suggests that finnock are typically fish of about half a pound in weight. Andrew Graham Stewart wrote that I have no explanation why virtually all sea trout in the aquaculture zone never mature. Whilst I've shown that some West Coast sea trout clearly do mature, it is also apparent from the fact that during 2019, 3,331 sea trout were caught by rod and line, and since 1987, a total of 202,891 sea trout have been caught from the aquaculture zone. All these fish must have had mature parents. There are a number of studies that have shown stocks of fish, including salmon and trout, have decreased in size over many years due to overexploitation. These graphs are from a study of wild-caught Alaskan salmon and trout. The body mass of all 4 species has fallen since the 1970s. Smaller sized fish have implications for maturity. This study of North Sea cod specifically looked at the age of maturation of the fish, which in some cases has halved from 11 to 6 years over a period of several decades. Monterey Bay's Seafood Watch programme summarises the problem, which has affected West Coast sea trout stocks. It is large fish that are first to go from slow-growing stocks that are vulnerable to overfishing. This slide is taken from a poster displayed in the corridor of the Freshwater Fisheries Laboratory at Pitlochry that focuses on the plight of sea trout fisheries. The graphic on the right sums up the issues. Sea trout are now scarcer, younger, smaller and produce less eggs. The left-hand panel highlights that the real problems for sea trout began in the 1980s. It's already apparent from comments made by Andrew Graham Stewart that he blames the arrival of salmon farming during the 1980s for these changes. Before I move on, the poster is illustrated with pictures of sea trout from the 20s and 30s, but I have chosen to use a different picture. I've been investigating West Coast sea trout for over 10 years, and during all that time I've never come across any reference to the fish pictured. This was caught in September 1951 from Loch Maree. It was estimated on landing to be in excess of 20 pounds, but when it was eventually weighed the following day, it was put at 19.5 pounds. It's thought to be the record fish caught from the loch. David McNaught, the angler who caught it, also describes the record catch from one boat of 2 rods in just one day. In July 1954, 17 sea trout were caught back with a weight of 79 pounds. No doubt Mr. Graham Stewart would love to see a return to such catches. Whilst I'm told there's no alternative explanation for sea trout declines other than salmon farming, Andrew Graham Stewart appears unaware that in 1984, 3 years before salmon farming arrived in Loch Ewe, the Scottish Government introduced new legislation to remove the 3-mile fishing limit that had previously prevented trawlers from fishing inshore waters, including inside West Coast sea lochs. This analysis, comparing catches of white fish species such as cod, whiting and saithe with that of sea trout, shown in red, shows that all suffered a massive decline after the inshore waters were opened up to commercial fishing after 1984. The collapse of white fish stocks and of sea trout are not a coincidence. The damage by commercial fishing to inshore fishing grounds continues even now, and the Scottish Creel Fishermen's Federation are lobbying hard to reimpose the 3-mile limit in order to protect and allow inshore stocks to recover. This would include sea trout, but rather strangely the angling sector doesn't seem to be that interested in supporting this campaign. Instead, Andrew Graham Stewart and Salmon and Trout Conservation continue their crusade against salmon farming. He states that the evidence is overwhelming against the salmon farming industry. Whilst he's happy to put this in print, he seems less willing to discuss this evidence face to face. I'm not so sure why he's so reluctant to do so, given that he's so convinced about the strength of the evidence. I would only be too pleased to hear from him so we can discuss the issues facing sea trout on Scotland's west coast. He only has to write or pick up the telephone. Meanwhile, and until then, thank you for watching.